years. Although mythology suggests that Ram and Sita stayed in Karachi, which would be about 3 millennia ago, on their way to Nani Mandir in Balochistan, one of the holiest Hindu yatras in the world. There's also speculation that Alexander skirted the coast, and Karachi figures in, travelogues. The Book of Fables, Fables comes to mind, an Irani travelogue, maybe in the 1400s. In the last 300 years, Karachi evolved from a scrim of coast to one of the largest cities in the world. The Talpurs lay siege to the city 3 times in the 1700s, each time repelled by the hardy denizens of the city. In 1795, the denizens of this city, the hardy denizens of the city, finally conceded when a force of 20,000 Baloch camped outside. They only conceded when on agreeing that the Baloch mercenaries could not enter the city. That was 1795. A few years later, the British attempted to set up a factory like they'd done in Calcutta a century, 2 centuries ago, and they were thrown out. So this city has sort of it has always been characterized by a tough population, a hardy population. As far as I go, my grandfather arrived here shortly after the creation of this state of India and the state of Pakistan, and would eventually end up in a neighborhood called Paposh Nagar. Paposh Nagar is where some of my family resides, Federal B area, buffer zone. My personal family history is grafted onto the cities in a very tangible way. And yet, I think I will spend the remainder of my life discovering it. After the publication of my first book, Homeboy, which is also set in a megalopolis that I find shares the energy of this city in many ways, I was asked to write about Pakistan, and I would say that I'm not privy to the machinations of Islamabad, I'm not privy to politics, and there are other facets to Pakistan, other facets to this city. One of my first assignments was to cover a home school in a neighborhood past the steel mills called Razakabad. Razakabad is a Waziri neighborhood. It's adjacent to Qazafi town, which is a Balochi neighborhood, and Pipri, which is a Shia neighborhood. In Razakabad, in the shadow of a Sipai Sahaba mosque, I walked into somebody's home. In Waziristan, my walking into anybody's home would make me wajbe qatl. Here, I went in, there was a tough matriarch sitting on a charpai, and her 2 daughters taught about 70, 80 children, co-ed. I inquired about the syllabus. They told me they learned English, Urdu, Sindhi. This is uncanny for Waziris to learn Sindhi. Drawing, Islamiyat. And so, it sounded great on paper, and I asked, I was intrigued, and I asked the students to get up and read from their reader. So this very pretty little girl stood up and far Angrezi mein passage padha, far Urdu mein passage padha. I asked somebody else, and it was sort of, it was remarkable that they had such a sort of broad syllabus. The brother of this family attended the mosque. He had a very large beard, and his shalwar was up to his ankles. And I wondered what dynamic informed this little ecosystem. How did this boy, who is not merely conservative, but sort of Waziris are thought to be retrogradely orthodox, allow this ecosystem to subsist here? And I learned that the old man, his father, passed away, and this young man had a decision to make. He had to take care of 3 women, and he decided that they should take care of themselves. And so, opening up a whole home school, they get a salary of 3,000 rupees a month each. They get a water cooler. They get a mobile health clinic. And so this family, this boy, made an economic decision, not a religious one. And in this city, anecdotally, I'm again a storyteller. I don't have empirical data to share. But anecdotally, people change in cities like in Karachi. When you have Balochis, Waziris, and Shias living in close proximity, they have to coexist, they have to survive. I will share another anecdote, a very different anecdote. As a young man, I had been taken to Thomas and Thomas by my father. And Thomas and Sadar was sort of a great mecca of, literatures at one juncture of Sadar's history. And in the recent past, when my father returned to Karachi, I thought I'd take him back to Thomas and Thomas. It had been maybe 30 odd years, and the time he spent in Sadar at Thomas and Thomas was about 60 years ago. And when he walked in, the man behind the counter said, "Naqvi Saab, aap?" This man, after 30, perhaps 60 years, recognized my father. And I relate this anecdote because this experience produced a short story, of which I'll read 2 paragraphs. This sort of exemplifies the way I function in this city. My experience in Razakabad produced an article, and my experience at Thomas & Thomas produced a short story. I'll read for 3-4 minutes. You can tell me when to stop.
3-4 minutes is fine.
I was ensconced at Thomas & Thomas one afternoon, inhaling the balm of damp pages, when a lean, elderly gentleman strode in, dressed in a woolen 3-piece suit, and demanded a copy of Robinson Crusoe at the register. Although he wore a knit skullcap, his wan complexion, like the delicate flesh of our Bekti, an orotund pronunciation suggested he was an Englishman, which was curious because Englishmen had been a dwindling species since the Raj. When he persisted and learned labored Urdu, "Tum samajhta hai," the boy behind the register shook his head like Man Friday. Surveying the shelves with one open eye, the gentleman grimaced, then produced a kerchief to pat his creased forehead. "Sala," he muttered from under his beaked nose. "Jahil," before turning to walk out. But before he left, I called out, "This way, sir." I could have located any volume in the store. It wasn't because I had formally studied history or philosophy or literature. I hadn't. I had studied communication, a discipline so new and nebulous that neither instructor nor student could articulate a cogent thought about it. In other days, I might have joined the restive, unemployed, or marginally employed youth of Karachi known to move in packs on motorcycles with detached silencers, but since the coup, there had been a renaissance in the media industry, an irony never quite reconciled by discourse. In time, MTV set up shop, a cross-dresser hosted a talk show, and politicians were held accountable on prime time. Unki patloone utar di, some would say. And in due course, I was snapped up by a startup channel and put to work procuring images mostly from the internet that corresponded to international news. Once in a while, during a strike or a monsoon, I was called to write a bulletin. Later, I would become a television personality in my own right, but at the time, a year and a half into my career, I was frustrated by the long hours and general lack of stimulation. And whenever I had a free afternoon, I would return to my childhood haunt and ways. I had practically grown up at Thomas and Thomas. I lived upstairs. As I guided the gentleman to Robinson Crusoe, negotiating shelves spaced too closely together, he asked whether I had read the novel. I nodded. I read it a decade earlier, perched tenuously on a stack of Life magazines. "Well, young man," he intoned, "what do you make of it?" It's okay," I blurted. It's nice." "Okay," he repeated like a schoolmaster. "Nice?" "Well," I stuttered, "I could elaborate." When the ostensible Englishman nodded emphatically, I told him I found it stylistically archaic and dramatically somewhat flat, but its role in the formal development of the novel, not to mention its philosophical implications, made it worthwhile. As he considered my response, considered me, he did not speak or move for a full minute. I avoided his steel-eyed gaze by scrutinizing my feet. Finally, he pronounced, "We should discuss this matter over a cup of tea." Grabbing me by the elbow, he tugged me into the weak sunshine and hailed a passing rickshaw. "I live around the corner," he said as we negotiated rush hour traffic. But he didn't live around the corner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rafi. We now continue with our last panelist, Mr. Arif Hassan, who will give us his thoughts on issues of governance and social change.
Well, I had done a little bit of preparation, and I was going to speak on governance issues. Basically, I was going to speak on two things. One, the very strong anti-poor bias in planning of the city. And I was going to speak about the ethnic conflict and its governance-related issues. However, I have decided not to do that. I will follow up on what Naqvi Saab has said and share a few things that are of relevance. And I think that are of relevance to writers in general, should be those who write about the city. Those who write about the city, it's a bit uncomfortable because it's pulling. It's okay. Write about the city. I don't wish to theorize, but I'll give some stories. First of all, I started working in the so-called Kachi Abadis in 1971. Those settlements that I worked in are no longer the same settlement. Urbanization, urban values, pressures of traveling, getting a job, and all that has changed them. In those days, they were purely working class settlements. Their leadership consisted of middle-aged men or old men who spoke in a nice, flowery language. Niyazmand hain, sharf hasil hua milke, Janab, Huzur, Sai, it's all gone. These are no longer purely working class settlements. These settlements have young men and women in them. They are the leadership today. They are literate, unlike the old leadership. They no longer petition government officials and politicians by saying, Janab, aapki jutiyon ki khaak hain, hamare liye ye kar dijiye. It's gone. They demand. And not only do they demand, but they know how to get their demands accepted. And that vocabulary is gone. I am no longer Sai or Huzur or whatever. I am uncle, and that too in English. So these are very big changes. Mickey Mouse is painted on the new schools that have come up, that the communities have set up themselves. Infrastructure has developed. But they still travel on run-down buses. They carry a shirt with them when they travel by bus in their bag, because the shirt is rumpled by the time they get to office, so they change. When they get off the bus in the central business district, there are shoe shine boys who clean their shoes because the shoes have been damaged in the process. And so more and more of them buy motorbikes. The motorbike is a great revolution. You may be against the motorbike, but it has changed the lives of hundreds and thousands of families for the better. And I think this is going to be a motorbike city. And Roland is quite right, there should be public transport. But even if there is, this will still be a motorbike city. A man, a woman on a motorbike